Welcome back. In this video, I'll be sharing responses to some of the principal objections to my theory on the synoptic problem, the Clementine Hebrew hypothesis. I'm going to focus here on what I believe are the most substantive critiques of my theory. In a later video, I will respond to some of the more speculative claims. First, I'd like to offer 3 clarifications from my previous videos. Sometimes it's not until well after the fact that you realize you've said something that could be very easily misinterpreted. Allow me to clarify 3 points. Number 1. Did you say in your last video that you think the synoptic problem is simple? No, I do not believe the synoptic problem is simple. Rather, I propose a solution that is simple. Certainly, we could invent all manner of hypothetical people and places and cultures, etc., 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 in order to come up with a very imaginative solution that can account for each of the categories of evidence we've been considering. I'm trying an Occam's razor approach. We're not multiplying entities beyond necessity. My theory is designed to be the simplest possible explanation of each of the categories of evidence. Number 2, you said that Mark doesn't translate well into Hebrew. Yeah, I probably should clarify that. Mark actually does translate fairly well into Hebrew, unless of course you're comparing it to Luke. Luke translates really well into Hebrew. That was the comparison that was being made in the previous video. Mark does not translate well into Hebrew compared to Luke. And number 3, have you ruled out the possibility that the translator who translated Hebrew Matthew into Greek Matthew could be influenced by the Greek of Luke? No, I have not ruled out that possibility. In fact, if I were to guess, I'd say it's fairly likely that the translator was influenced by Luke's Greek, but evidently had a preference for Mark. Now let's take a look at what is far and away the most prominent objection to my theory. Greek Matthew cannot be a translation. It does not look like a translation. It does not bear the telltale signs of a translation. Well, this objection is a little bit arbitrary. Some translations are better than others. I recall with a little bit of humor the exercise of researching various views on whether Greek Matthew is a translation or not, and what you'll often find is the statement, Greek Matthew does not bear the telltale signs of a translation. Okay, well, why is that? We'll check the footnote, go to the source. What does it say? It says exactly the same thing. Greek Matthew does not bear the telltale signs of a translation. Okay, but I want to know why. Check the footnote, go to the source, it says the same thing again. Unfortunately, what we see frequently occurring is people are parroting this line without really diving into why. I suspect one of the reasons people don't want to dive into why the claim is made that Greek Matthew does not look like a translation is because the argument overall is relatively weak. I'm not saying there's no argument, it's just a relatively weak one. Not all translations are created equal. As one who has done some translation, I recognize that some translations are really cheap, where anybody who knows both languages can readily tell which of the 2 languages was the original. Some translations are better, it's a spectrum. Some translations have a few vestiges of the original language, but actually flow reasonably well in the target language. And then, of course, there are top-of-the-line translations. Really, really good translations where you would not know unless you were told that this is a translation. Yes, there are translators who are that good. And yes, there were ancient translators who were that good. Sometimes we in modern times are tempted to think, well, if I couldn't do a translation that good, nobody can. Well, people who have studied a language for a few years may not be able to do a translation that well. Consider, many of these ancient translators weren't dealing with dead languages. They were dealing with languages they had grown up around their entire lives. Yes, there were brilliant people in the past, and yes, there were good translations in the past. Claude Tresmontant has observed that sometimes we are too quick to jump to conclusions. This doesn't look like a translation, it's too good. In fact, he pointed out that while we don't have all of the ancient Jewish literature, the Old Testament and the Apocrypha, in Hebrew, even though these documents were originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic, not Greek, in some cases there have been people who have claimed, we think Greek is the original because we don't have the Hebrew text. The Greek is good, it doesn't look like a translation. In fact, in one case, as Tresmontant points out, people were claiming up until the very day a Hebrew text was discovered, this was originally written in Greek, only for the Hebrew text to show up and prove the point wrong. So the track record of claiming this doesn't look like a translation isn't exactly stellar. And in fact, when you look at the work of the Hebrew scholars, people who really know Hebrew from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hebrew of the time and place, people like Robert Lindsey, Claude Tresmontant, John Carmignac, they've had no trouble at all seeing the Hebrew structure beneath the Gospel of Matthew. A very interesting piece of evidence that has come forward in substantiation of their claims is what is called Shem Tov Matthew. This is a copy of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew that was written into a 14th century polemic by a Jewish scholar against Christianity. He copied the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew into his book. George Howard, a modern scholar who is one of the greatest experts on Shem Tov Matthew, pointed out that if you want to talk about books that do not look like a translation, Hebrew Matthew from Shem Tov does not look like a translation. And he gives specific evidences. The word plays in Hebrew Matthew as preserved by Shem Tov do not look like something that came from Greek, because they are plays on words that work in Hebrew that do not work in Greek. And Jews who were copying Matthew for the purpose of criticizing and denigrating it weren't about to add literary flair to their opponents to make them look good. George Howard also concluded that the Hebrew in Shem Tov Matthew does not look like it is a derivative of any known Greek or Latin translation of Matthew. Certainly it is a corrupted text. It's 13 plus centuries removed from the original. But if ever there were a surviving vestige of Hebrew Matthew, this very well may be it. It looks like there is a document that had been passed through Jewish hands for many centuries that actually preserved a decent portion of the original Hebrew of the Gospel of Matthew. If Shem Tov is not a translation, that would mean we're looking at an original composition of Matthew in Hebrew. So Matthew could be a translation. If it is, it's a good one. Now I'm going to make a generalization here. It isn't always true, but it's true frequently enough to cause some interesting questions. Most of the people claiming that Greek Matthew cannot be a translation from Hebrew are people who are experts in Greek, but not so much in Hebrew. The Hebrew scholars, several of them I've mentioned, when they look at it, they say, yes, the Hebrew is very apparent. We can see the Hebrew beneath the Greek text of Matthew. Now let's acknowledge the best claim that is being made by those who argue that Greek Matthew could not be a translation. We're not going to deal with the specious argument that ancient translators just weren't that good, or the idea that some have retreated into a bubble and said, okay, yeah, there were translators who were good, but none of them were Christian because Christians in the early years were all ignorant rabble. No, the epistles of Paul alone can refute that claim, as can many other evidences. But there is a decent argument being made by those who claim that Greek Matthew does not look like a translation. And that is the observation that when Matthew quotes the Old Testament, it usually quotes the Greek Septuagint Old Testament. Now there's a weak argument here and there's a strong argument here. Let's quickly dispense with the weak one. The fact alone that Matthew quotes the Septuagint does not tell us that Matthew was written in Greek. It could still be a translation because, as any decent translator knows, when you translate a passage that is well known in the target language, you do not free translate the passage if you can avoid it. What do? You refer to an already accepted translation. For example, if I were to translate Julius Caesar's words Veni Vidi Vici as I arrived, I saw, I conquered, I would lose my credibility as a translator. I would lose the confidence of my audience because everybody knows you're supposed to say it, I came, I saw, I conquered. Well, Julius did not in fact say I arrived or I came. He said Veni. He didn't speak English. But there is an accepted translation, and so a good translator will use it. Given this information, if Jesus taught from the Old Testament in Hebrew, and somebody was writing down his teachings in Greek, when they come to an Old Testament passage, what a good translator should do is refer to the accepted Greek translation found in the Septuagint, and that's what they write. And so Hebrew Matthew can be perfectly compatible with the Greek Septuagint showing up in Greek Matthew. That's the weak argument. Now let's look at the stronger argument. There are a handful of places where Jesus says something that makes sense in Greek but does not make sense in Hebrew. The most notable example being Matthew 21:16. This is where they ask him, do you hear what these kids are saying? Have you not read out of the mouth of babes? It's become a cliche now. It shows up in the Greek Septuagint, but not in the Hebrew Old Testament. Jesus is quoting a statement from the Old Testament that is only found in Greek. Now, I do offer a gentle caution about making sweeping claims about whether the Hebrew Masoretic text or the Greek Septuagint in all cases is closer to the original. But let's set that aside for a moment and grant for sake of argument that Jesus is saying something only found in the Greek Septuagint. Why can't Jesus be familiar with the Greek Septuagint? An itinerant preacher traveling in places where Greek is widely spoken would be expected to be familiar with the Greek scriptures. This is very common among ministers who preach in more than one language. I've preached in more than one language. And yes, I have scriptures memorized in multiple languages. Now, I may not have as many scriptures memorized in Spanish, my second language, as I do in English, my first language, but you bet if I'm teaching in Spanish, I can cite the scriptures in Spanish. You would expect a multilingual itinerant preacher to be able to refer to the scriptures in multiple languages. Later in this video, we'll do a deeper dive on what languages Jesus knew and spoke. For right now, all we need to observe is that if Jesus could in fact teach in Greek, then Matthew's preservation of the Greek text of the Old Testament in Matthew 21:16 and comparable examples does not tell us the language in which Matthew was originally written. Rather, it tells us the language Jesus was speaking on that occasion. If he was multilingual, and the evidence suggests he was, then he would speak different languages based on who his audience was. So, if Jesus spoke in Hebrew or Aramaic, and a gospel writer was writing in Greek, they'd have to translate the Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. Everybody agrees with that. It works the other way too. If Jesus taught, sometimes in Greek, and somebody wrote a gospel in Hebrew, they'd have to translate the Greek into Hebrew. It works both ways. And so the evidence from the Septuagint is not that surprising. It simply acknowledges Jesus probably taught sometimes in Greek. Now let's take a look at a handful of other criticisms of my theory. Next, scholarship has gone in a different direction. Scholarship has looked at similar ideas, maybe not identical ones, and they moved on. So clearly that means there wasn't much to be offered here. I'd like to quote John A.T. Robinson on this issue. He said it extraordinarily well. "One cannot help observing how the caravan of New Testament scholarship has tended to move on to fresh sites, attracted by different and exciting questions, but leaving behind the other workings in the state in which they then were, and taking over their results to date, without further re-examination, as the presuppositions of the new work. This, I suggested, happened, notably in regard to the synoptic problem, both when the form critics took over from the source critics, and when the redaction critics took over from the form critics. These newer disciplines have had much illumination to shed, but they become dangerously unrelated to reality when they ignore detailed investigation of the introductory questions, and still more when they claim that these can be settled by the answers to their own questions." Robinson said it quite well. The fact that scholarship has moved on does not mean that there wasn't something there to be discovered. Next, where did the rest of Luke's material come from? You mentioned that Luke had Hebrew sources. My goal with my theory is to go as far as the evidence leads, but no further. I do not know the answer to that question. I can positively identify one of Luke's sources, Matthew, but do not know what the other sources were. I would also like to take a look at a statement made by an eminent synoptic scholar, Mark Goodacre, a man whom I respect, who pointed out that you cannot solve the synoptic problem in the abstract. I would tend to agree. I would also suggest that there's a danger in going too far in the other direction. We should not seek to explain every word in the Gospels. If we overspecify the theory, we risk creating an explanation that is in fact more complicated and requires more assumptions than the problem it was trying to solve. I am concerned that if we try to get too far into the heads of the authors, they shouldn't have used this word here and they can't use this word there, and well, they would have used this word in this sense, we become too subjective. I suggest an objective approach in which we look for patterns, and rather than explaining every word in the Gospels, which we cannot do, we can put every word into a category, for which categories there are viable explanations. Without going too far down the path of mind-reading the author and becoming very subjective, in which case the synoptic problem is just, well, it's my opinion, I don't think the author should do this, versus my opinion, I think they should. It's an objective evaluation. Every word has a category, every category has an explanation. I can't explain every word and why they chose this word in this case, but I can explain how these categories of evidence could have arisen. In this way, we still deal with the nitty-gritty without losing sight of the big picture. The final topic I'd like to cover is what languages were in use by the people of Judea and Galilee at the time of Jesus. I'd like to take this one by the horns. What languages did Jesus know and speak? The monolingual Aramaic world theory is outdated. It was fashionable more than a century ago to say he only spoke Aramaic, nothing else. The Greek and the Hebrew must have come later. Some have questioned how can it be that the Jews produced a lot of literature in the centuries prior to the first century, and they produced a lot of literature in the centuries just after, but there seems to be a dearth of literature in the first century. How can that be? Some have come up with all manner of speculative conclusions, including the idea maybe they just stopped writing things. No, we have plenty of evidence that they were writing things. If anyone would like to know why there is a dearth of literature from the time period just before the destruction of the temple, they need only read Josephus's account of the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. Titus did not say, as you're destroying this city, if you find any documents, bring them back to camp, let's make a copy of them, and then proceed. No, they burned to the ground the literary capital of Judea, and much literature was lost. Let's now take a look at two specific languages. First, let's do Greek. Some have said, nope, Jesus wouldn't have spoken Greek. In Galilee, they were monolingual. No, the evidence has come out decidedly against this. Some still like the theory because they've used it as a foundation for other conclusions they want to prove, but if we stick with the evidence, yeah, they definitely knew Greek. Let's look at a few examples. First are the ossuaries, the bone boxes. The inscriptions, what we might call epitaphs today, in many of them are written in Greek. So ask yourself this question. Are you going to bury your loved ones with an epitaph written in Mandarin Chinese? Well, sure, if that's part of your heritage, your family. But if not, it doesn't matter that Mandarin is the #1 spoken first language in the world today. You're going to use a language that means something to you and to your family. The fact that people were burying their loved ones with epitaphs in Greek shows that there were people who spoke Greek. Let's take a look at some of the scholarship. For previous generations, I recommend the work of Zahn and Sevenster, who argued cogently that yes, people in Galilee spoke Greek. For something more recent, let's take a look at Porter. He has made the case very effectively that people in Galilee surrounded by the Greek-speaking cities of the Decapolis definitely would have spoken Greek. A man who was involved in the community and traveled a fair bit could hardly be expected to have not known Greek. Let's take a look at some quotes that were summarized by John A.T. Robinson in his work Redating the New Testament. From Zahn. Zahn maintained that it would have been impossible for the early Christian leaders to have fulfilled the immediate duties of their office, such as are described in Acts 8 through 11, let alone done anything beyond Palestine, without a good deal of readiness in Greek. Next, from Sevenster. It is no longer possible to refute such a possibility, if they spoke Greek, by recalling that these were usually people of modest origins. It has now been clearly demonstrated that a knowledge of Greek was in no way restricted to the upper circles, which were permeated with Hellenistic culture, but was to be found in all circles of Jewish society, and certainly in places bordering on regions where Greek was much spoken, e.g. Galilee. Robinson also references Weiss, who points out that Paul's audience at the temple expected him to speak to them in Greek. This is a time and place where Greek was being spoken. Now let's take a look at Hebrew. Some have said, well, biblical Hebrew was a dead language in the first century. This is a little bit misleading. First, because the language they were speaking was Mishnaic Hebrew, which is a descendant of biblical Hebrew. Hebrew, like all languages, changed over time. The Hebrew from 1000 BC was different from the Hebrew of 600 BC, was different from the Hebrew of 400 BC, was different from the Hebrew of the first century. Any language does that. But was biblical Hebrew a dead language? Well, more or less in the same sense you might say that Shakespearean English is a dead language. Is it? Well, yes, in the sense that it's not how people speak colloquially, but no in the sense that it's a language that now only exists in academia. Some of the most influential English texts of all time were written in Shakespearean English. For example, the writings of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. These texts aren't just studied by a handful of academics, they aren't just read. They're spoken aloud. In theaters and churches all around the world, people speak and understand Shakespearean English. We'll find that biblical Hebrew in the first century is in a similar boat. Some of the most influential Hebrew texts of all time, like the Torah, Isaiah, were written in biblical Hebrew. And so while the people may not have colloquially spoken biblical Hebrew, they certainly understood it. But now let's direct our attention to Mishnaic Hebrew, a language that was very much alive and spoken in the area in the time where Jesus lived. Frank Luke has compiled some excellent scholarship on this issue, looking at literature from Judaism in Hebrew, demonstrating that this was a living language. To quote his words, that literature includes First Maccabees, originally in Hebrew, the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of the Palestinian Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, all Palestinian rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Jerusalem Talmud, all the Midrash. The Midrash can be compared to sermon illustrations that would be used in a preaching environment. Note that they were to be told to the common people and were in Hebrew. Additionally, there are multiple letters from late Second Temple Judaism and just after that were also written in Hebrew. The Dead Sea Scrolls alone put the nail in the coffin that people did not know Hebrew at this time. Most of them are in Hebrew, and it's not just copies of the Old Testament where people were copying a scroll and maybe they didn't understand what it meant. No, they've got other literature. People were actually writing and communicating in Hebrew. Claude Tresmontant has also spoken on the Targums. Prior to the destruction of the temple, you could give an oral translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Aramaic. So you'd have somebody in the synagogue who's got the Hebrew scroll, and they'll speak orally in Aramaic. But writing the Hebrew scriptures in Aramaic was prohibited. So we're talking about a time where the synagogue has documents written in Hebrew. We can also look at some of the Hebrew scholars. We mentioned Robert Lindsey earlier, who has had no difficulty through his study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospels in finding that, yes, there is a clear Hebrew structure to this material. They're living in a world in which Hebrew is alive and well. Another interesting example comes from Josephus. He points out a passage where soldiers were speaking in the heat of battle in Hebrew. They had to make really quick calls. You don't have time to think of some clever way to say this in another language. If you're speaking in Hebrew in that setting, clearly this is not the first time you've spoken Hebrew. I'd like to cite some additional material from Frank Luke about teaching in Hebrew. The only collection of rabbinic literature in Aramaic is the Babylonian Talmud. This should not be surprising because it was compiled in Babylon, where Aramaic was spoken. However, even the Babylonian Talmud preserves its Mishnah portion in Hebrew. The commentary on the Mishnah is in Aramaic, but the Mishnah remains in Hebrew. In addition, whenever a later Palestinian rabbi is quoted in the commentary, the quote will be in Hebrew, while the discussion of the quote is in Aramaic. Parables are also preserved in the Babylonian commentary in Hebrew. Parables were intended to be taught to the common people. They were far from academic exercises. Even though thousands of parables have been found in Hebrew, or Greek as recorded in the New Testament, not one parable in the Talmud or anywhere else has been found in Aramaic. We're clearly talking about people who understood that Hebrew was the language of their faith. 3 final points from Frank Luke. The coins. Hebrew inscriptions on coins far and away outnumber Aramaic inscriptions on coins. Second, the rabbinic literature points out that it wasn't just the well-educated who spoke Hebrew. It says that women and children spoke Hebrew. And note, this is a time and place when women often did not have the opportunity to receive an education. And third, Greek has a word for Aramaic, suristi. It never shows up in the New Testament. They talk about people speaking the Hebrew tongue. They had a perfectly good way to refer to Aramaic had they wanted to, and never in the New Testament does this word appear. The problem we run into then, when people try to claim that the early Christians were monolingual Aramaic peasants, is that they're trying to cram a trilingual world into a monolingual box. Some, particularly in the US, have fallen for the assumption that most people speak only one language and it's just a handful of really well-educated people that speak more than one. No, this is a sampling error. This isn't true of most of the world today, and it isn't true of most of the world throughout history. Lots of people speak more than one language. I speak more than one language, and I'm not that special. The best concise summary, admittedly ever so slightly oversimplified, of the trilingual world in which Jesus lived that I've ever encountered is that Aramaic was the language of the home, Hebrew was the language of the synagogue, and Greek was the language of the marketplace. Let's summarize the ground we've covered in responding to criticisms of the Clementine Hebrew hypothesis. We pointed out that Matthew could be a translation. If it is, it's a good one. And that Matthew's use of the Greek Septuagint does not indicate the language in which Matthew was originally written. It may indicate the language that Jesus was speaking at the time. We've noted that it is dangerous to become too subjective in trying to solve the synoptic problem, in which every word needs a separate explanation. No, we can deal with the nitty-gritty, but every category needs an explanation on a more objective approach that I've tried to pursue here. And finally, we've shown that the evidence strongly suggests that Jesus and his early followers would have been proficient in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. After considering these critiques, the Clementine Hebrew hypothesis remains intact, and its explanatory power is undiminished.